It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seemed to slow down just enough for people to catch their breath. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the empty roads. In a small suburban neighborhood, two police officers sat in their patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups as they kept an eye out for anything unusual. Officer Mark Johnson adjusted his seatbelt and glanced at his partner, Officer Ryan Davis. "Slow night," he muttered, brushing crumbs off his uniform. Ryan nodded, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. The hum of the engine filled the silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. Suddenly, Ryan pointed ahead. "Hey, look at that car up there." Sure enough, a sedan was driving slowly down the road, its right taillight completely out. It wasn't hard to spot. The blinking red light on one side made it obvious something was wrong. "That's our cue," Mark said, setting his cup in the holder. He flipped on the flashing lights and eased the cruiser behind the sedan. The driver signaled and pulled over smoothly, parking along the curb without hesitation. Both officers exchanged a quick glance. The stop seemed routine, but you never knew what might come next. As they approached the vehicle, flashlights in hand, Mark couldn't help but notice how calm the driver appeared. She was a black woman, dressed sharply in a navy blue blazer and slacks, her posture straight and confident. Her hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, visible even before she rolled down the window. Something about her demeanor felt different, composed, almost regal. But Mark pushed the thought aside. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, shining his flashlight into the car with practiced ease. "Do you know why we stopped you?" The woman met his gaze steadily, her voice smooth and polite. "I assume it's because my taillight is out?" She reached into her bag and produced her license and registration without being asked, handing them over with a slight smile. "I'll get it fixed as soon as I can." Mark took the documents, nodding briefly. "Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate your cooperation." He stepped back toward the cruiser, motioning for Ryan to follow. As they walked, Ryan raised an eyebrow. "She seems put together, doesn't she? Not like most folks we pull over." "Yeah," Mark replied, glancing at the papers in his hand. The name on the license read Elena Carter. There was something vaguely familiar about it, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like she owned the road beneath her tires. Or maybe it was just wishful thinking after too many late shifts. Back in the cruiser, Ryan typed the license plate into the system while Mark double-checked the paperwork. Everything seemed to check out. No outstanding tickets, no criminal record, nothing suspicious. But still, something nagged at both of them. This wasn't just another ordinary traffic stop. The air around them felt charged, as if they were missing something important. While they worked, Elena sat patiently in her car, watching them through the rearview mirror. She'd been here before, not literally but figuratively. Too many times she'd found herself explaining her presence in places where others didn't expect to see someone like her. A black woman in a position of authority? That often raised eyebrows, whether at conferences, meetings, or even casual encounters like this one. But tonight she wasn't fazed. If anything, she was curious. These officers were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. A lesson about assumptions, respect, and the weight of responsibility. And unbeknownst to them, this seemingly routine traffic stop would become the talk of the precinct for weeks to come. Meanwhile, back in the patrol car, Ryan leaned forward suddenly. "Wait a second," he said, tapping the screen. "Doesn't that name sound familiar?" Mark frowned, trying to recall. Then it hit him. He remembered seeing a news article earlier that week. The city was set to welcome its first ever black female police chief, a trailblazer named Dr. Elena Carter. Rumors had swirled about her arrival, but Mark hadn't paid much attention. After all, big announcements rarely trickled down to beat cops like him. Now, staring at the license in his hand, everything clicked into place. His stomach dropped. "Oh no," he thought. "Please don't let this be who I think it is." Ryan noticed his partner's expression change. "What is it?" he whispered urgently. Mark hesitated, then muttered under his breath, I think that's Dr. Carter." Ryan froze. You mean the Dr. Carter? The new chief? Mark nodded grimly. They both stared at the sedan parked ahead, now realizing they were dealing with someone far more significant than a random motorist. Their hearts raced as they tried to figure out what to do next. How do you handle a situation like this? Do you apologize profusely? Pretend nothing happened? Or just hope she doesn't hold it against you once she takes office? For a moment, neither officer moved. The gravity of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They weren't just enforcing the law anymore. They were standing face to face with their future boss. And judging by the composed look on her face, she already knew exactly who they were. Little did they know. This encounter would mark the beginning of a journey neither of them could have anticipated, one that would challenge their perceptions, redefine their roles, and ultimately reshape the very department they served. As the two officers stood frozen in the dim glow of their patrol car's headlights, the weight of the situation pressed down on them like a storm cloud. They had been so focused on following protocol that they hadn't stopped to consider who or what they were dealing with. Now realizing they might have just pulled over their future boss, panic began to creep into their thoughts. Mark glanced at Ryan, his face pale under the flickering streetlight. "What do we do now?" he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady but failing miserably. Ryan shrugged, equally unsure. Neither of them wanted to make things worse by saying or doing the wrong thing. But they couldn't exactly ignore the fact that Dr. Elena Carter was sitting calmly in her car, waiting for them to finish whatever it was they were supposed to be doing. Back at the sedan, Elena watched the two men through her rearview mirror. She could see their body language shift, heads tilted close together, hands gesturing nervously, and occasional glances back at her. It didn't take a genius to figure out something was up. She sighed softly, leaning back against the headrest. This wasn't the first time she'd found herself in a situation like this, though it was certainly one of the more ironic ones. She thought about how often people underestimated her based on appearances alone. Whether it was during her early days as a rookie officer or later when she climbed the ranks, there had always been doubters, people who assumed she didn't belong in positions of authority simply because of the color of her skin or her gender. Over time, she learned not to let it bother her too much. Instead, she used those moments as opportunities to prove them wrong. Tonight, however, felt different. These weren't random strangers. These were officers from her department, the very team she would soon lead. Meanwhile, Mark and Ryan were still struggling to decide their next move. Finally, Ryan spoke up. "We can't just stand here forever," he said quietly. "Let's wrap this up before it gets any weirder." "Wrap it up? Are you kidding me?" Mark shot back, keeping his voice low. "This isn't some random person we're talking about. This is Dr. Carter, our new chief." "I know that," Ryan snapped, then immediately lowered his tone. "But what choice do we have? We've already stopped her. Do we just let her go without addressing the taillight? That doesn't look good either." Mark groaned, rubbing his temples. He hated being stuck between a rock and a hard place, especially when the stakes were this high. Still, Ryan had a point. They couldn't undo what had already happened. All they could do now was try to handle the situation professionally and hope Dr. Carter wouldn't hold it against them once she officially took charge. Taking a deep breath, Mark straightened his posture and walked back to the sedan, Ryan trailing behind him. When they reached the driver's side window, Elena rolled it down slightly, her expression unreadable. "Is everything all right, officers?" she asked coolly, her tone polite but laced with curiosity. Mark cleared his throat, fumbling for words. Yes, ma'am, everything checks out fine, just, He hesitated, glancing at Ryan for support. Ryan stepped forward, attempting to salvage the moment. "We noticed your taillight is out, ma'am," he explained quickly. "It's probably best to get that fixed as soon as possible. Other than that, you're free to go." Elena raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by their attempt to play it off casually. "I see," she said slowly. "And is that all?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Both officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. They could sense that she knew exactly what was going on, that she understood the significance of this encounter far better than they did. Yet she didn't call them out directly. Instead, she seemed content to let them squirm a little longer. Finally, Mark mustered the courage to speak again. "Ma'am, if I may ask, do you happen to know anything about the new police chief coming in?" The question sounded absurd even to his own ears, but he figured it was worth a shot. Maybe she'd laugh it off or brush it aside. Either way, it would give them a chance to gauge her reaction. To their surprise, Elena smiled faintly. "Funny you should mention that," she said, her voice calm but tinged with amusement. "I've heard she's quite dedicated to reforming the department. From what I understand, she believes in accountability, transparency, and fairness above all else." Her words hit home harder than any lecture ever could. Both officers exchanged guilty looks, realizing they were standing in front of someone who embodied those very principles. Here they were, representatives of the department she planned to transform, and they'd already managed to botch their first interaction with her. Ryan cleared his throat, visibly flustered. "Well, that sounds like a great approach, ma'am. We'll, make sure to keep that in mind moving forward." Elena nodded, her smile widening ever so slightly. "I'm glad to hear it," she replied. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "Now, unless there's anything else, I really should be going. I have a busy day ahead tomorrow." Realizing they'd overstayed their welcome, Mark and Ryan stepped back hastily. "Of course, ma'am, thank you for your patience," Mark stammered, offering a weak salute. Elena gave them a final nod before rolling up her window and pulling away from the curb. As her car disappeared into the night, the two officers stood there dumbfounded, watching the red glow of her working taillight fade into the distance. Neither of them said a word for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Ryan broke the silence. "Well, that was something." Mark nodded, still staring blankly at the empty road. "Yeah, something tells me this is gonna come back to haunt us." Ryan chuckled nervously. "Probably, but hey, at least we handled it. Sort of." Sort of was putting it mildly. They both knew they'd made mistakes tonight, not just in pulling her over, but in the way they'd approached the entire situation. And while they couldn't change what had happened, they also couldn't deny the lesson they'd just learned. Sometimes the people you least expect to teach you something are the ones who leave the biggest impact. For Mark and Ryan, this traffic stop was more than just an embarrassing mix-up. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that leadership comes in many forms, and sometimes it shows up when you least expect it. As they climbed back into their patrol car and drove off into the quiet suburban night, neither of them could shake the feeling that their jobs and their perspectives were about to change in ways they hadn't anticipated. The drive home for Dr. Elena Carter was quiet, but her mind buzzed with thoughts about the encounter she'd just had. She wasn't angry, frustrated perhaps, but not angry. Over the years, she had learned to channel such moments into fuel for change rather than letting them consume her. Still, there was something particularly striking about tonight's events. These weren't just any officers. They were part of the team she would soon lead, and if their behavior during this traffic stop was any indication, the road ahead might be bumpier than she'd anticipated. Back at the precinct, word of the incident spread like wildfire. Officer Mark Johnson and Officer Ryan Davis returned to their patrol car after letting Dr. Carter go, both feeling a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. As they drove back toward the station, neither spoke for a long while. The silence between them was heavy, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ryan broke the tension. "Do you think she'll remember us?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Mark sighed deeply, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Honestly, probably. How could she forget? We pulled her over less than 24 hours before she's set to take office. If anything, it's going to make her first day even more memorable, for all the wrong reasons." Ryan slumped in his seat, rubbing his temples. "Man, I knew things were changing around here, but I didn't think we'd be making headlines before she even steps foot in the building." As they pulled into the parking lot of the precinct, the weight of the situation began to sink in further. Word had already reached some of their colleagues thanks to dispatch overhearing snippets of their radio chatter. By the time Mark and Ryan walked through the doors, curious glances followed them everywhere. A few officers snickered quietly, but most looked genuinely concerned, or worse, sympathetic. Sergeant Harper, a grizzled veteran who had seen his fair share of department shakeups, approached them as they entered the break room. His expression was stern, though not unkind. "So," he said, crossing his arms, "I hear you two met our new chief last night?" Mark winced, knowing there was no point in denying it. "Yeah, we did. Not exactly how we planned it." Harper raised an eyebrow. "You don't say. Care to explain?" Ryan hesitated, then launched into an awkward recounting of the traffic stop. He described how they'd noticed the broken taillight, how routine everything seemed at first, and how realization dawned on them only after running her license. By the time he finished, Harper's face was unreadable. After a pause, Harper shook his head slowly. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. This is bad optics. Real bad. But what matters now is how you handle it moving forward." "What do you mean?" Mark asked, leaning forward. "I mean, when Dr. Carter officially takes charge tomorrow, you need to show her and everyone else that you're willing to learn from this. Own your mistakes and use them to grow. That's leadership. And if you can't do that..." He let the sentence trail off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Both officers nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the moment. They couldn't undo what had happened, but they could control how they responded to it. For the rest of the shift, they kept to themselves, replaying the sergeant's advice in their minds. The next morning, the atmosphere at the precinct was electric. Officers milled about nervously, adjusting their uniforms and whispering among themselves. Today marked a historic occasion, the swearing-in of Dr. Elena Carter as the city's first black female police chief. Her appointment had been widely celebrated in the media, hailed as a step toward greater diversity and reform within law enforcement. But for those inside the department, today carried an added layer of tension. Everyone wondered how she would address the challenges facing the force and whether she'd mention the infamous traffic stop. When Dr. Carter arrived, she commanded attention without saying a word. Dressed in a crisp navy blue uniform adorned with polished badges, she exuded authority and grace. As she made her way to the podium set up in the main hall, the room fell silent. Every officer stood at attention, including Mark and Ryan, who tried their best to blend into the crowd. Dr. Carter began her speech by acknowledging the significance of the day. "Today is not just about me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about the future of this department and the community we serve. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with accountability, and accountability begins with each of us." Her words resonated deeply, especially with Mark and Ryan, who exchanged uneasy glances. They braced themselves, half expecting her to call them out right then and there. But instead, she continued, weaving a narrative about trust, transparency, and mutual respect. Then came the moment that caught everyone off guard. Midway through her speech, she paused and smiled faintly. "Before I conclude, I want to share a brief story, a reminder of why our work matters so much." She recounted the events of the previous evening, describing the traffic stop in detail. The room grew tense as officers realized where she was headed. "When those officers stopped me," she continued, "they were doing their job. But what struck me wasn't the stop itself, it was the assumptions behind it. Assumptions are dangerous, whether they're about someone's intentions, background, or role in society. And as leaders, it's our responsibility to challenge those assumptions every single day." Her gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Mark and Ryan. Neither man dared to meet her eyes, their faces burning with shame. Yet, despite the discomfort, her tone remained compassionate rather than accusatory. "This department has incredible potential," she concluded, "but realizing that potential requires honesty, with ourselves and with each other. Let's start today by committing to that honesty. Together we can build something truly remarkable." The applause that followed was thunderous, filled with a mix of admiration and relief. For Mark and Ryan, however, the moment was bittersweet. They felt exposed, yes, but also strangely hopeful. Here was a leader who didn't shy away from difficult truths yet still extended a hand to help others rise above them. As the ceremony ended and officers filed out of the hall, Mark turned to Ryan. "Well," he said, exhaling sharply, "that could have gone worse." Ryan chuckled nervously. "Yeah, but she basically called us out in front of everyone." "True," Mark admitted, "but she also gave us a chance to fix it. Guess we'd better not waste it." For the rest of the day, the precinct buzzed with conversations about Dr. Carter's speech. Some praised her boldness, while others marveled at her ability to turn an awkward situation into a teachable moment. But for Mark and Ryan, the experience served as a turning point. It forced them to confront their biases and reevaluate how they approach their roles, not just as enforcers of the law, but as members of a community striving for progress. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. Dr. Carter's leadership style was rooted in action, not just words. In the weeks and months to come, she would implement sweeping changes aimed at fostering trust and equity within the department. Training programs focused on implicit bias, community outreach initiatives, and policy reforms became top priorities. And for Mark and Ryan, the lessons they learned that night stayed with them, shaping the way they interacted with the public and with each other for the rest of their careers. What started as an embarrassing misstep ultimately became a catalyst for growth. For Dr. Elena Carter, it was proof that even the most uncomfortable moments could lead to meaningful change. And for the officers under her command, it was a reminder that true leadership isn't about perfection. It's about learning, adapting, and striving to do better every single day. The days following Dr. Elena Carter's swearing-in ceremony were a whirlwind of activity at the precinct. The officers quickly learned that their new chief wasn't one for idle promises or empty speeches. She was a woman of action, and her first order of business was clear: reform. But she didn't come in wielding a hammer, ready to tear everything down. Instead, she approached change with a steady hand, guiding the department through a series of thoughtful initiatives designed to foster trust, accountability, and understanding. For Mark Johnson and Ryan Davis, the traffic stop incident loomed over them like a shadow they couldn't shake. They had been given a second chance by Dr. Carter, but both men knew that simply moving on wasn't enough. If they wanted to prove themselves, not just to her but to the entire department, they needed to step up in ways they never had before. It started with training. One of Dr. Carter's earliest decisions was to implement mandatory workshops on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. These weren't your typical PowerPoint presentations where officers half-listened while scrolling through their phones. No, these sessions were interactive, challenging, and often uncomfortable. Led by experts from outside organizations, the workshops forced officers to confront their own preconceived notions about race, gender, socioeconomic status, and authority. Mark and Ryan found themselves seated side by side during one such session, squirming as the facilitator guided them through exercises designed to uncover hidden biases. At first, they resisted. "I don't see color," Mark muttered under his breath when asked to reflect on racial stereotypes. Ryan nodded in agreement, though less confidently, but the facilitator wasn't having it. "Saying you don't see color is like saying you don't notice the weather," he said firmly. "It doesn't mean you're unbiased, it means you're ignoring something important, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away." That comment hit home for both men. For the rest of the session, they listened more intently, reflecting on how their actions, both intentional and unintentional, could impact those around them. It wasn't easy. Some of the discussions left them feeling defensive, even angry. But slowly, pieces began to click into place. They realized that being part of a diverse community meant recognizing differences, not erasing them, and using that awareness to build stronger relationships. Meanwhile, Dr. Carter wasted no time rolling out other changes. She established monthly town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns directly to officers. She also created a citizen advisory board made up of community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens who would work alongside the department to identify areas for improvement. Her goal was simple yet ambitious: bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. At first, many officers, including Mark and Ryan, were skeptical. Town halls? Advisory boards? To them, these sounded like distractions from their real jobs. But as they attended the first few meetings, something unexpected happened. They began hearing stories from people they'd sworn to protect, stories of fear, frustration, and mistrust. Some spoke about loved ones lost to police violence. Others shared experiences of profiling or harassment. While not all accusations were fair, the sheer volume of grievances forced the officers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their presence alone wasn't enough to ensure safety. Trust had to be earned. Dr. Carter encouraged her officers to engage openly during these meetings, reminding them that listening was just as important as speaking. If we want to rebuild trust, she told them, we have to be willing to sit in discomfort. That's where growth happens. Inspired by her words, Mark decided to take a more active role. During one town hall, a young woman stood up and recounted a harrowing story about being pulled over late at night. Her voice trembled as she described the panic she felt when multiple officers surrounded her car, guns drawn, all because someone thought her vehicle matched the description of a stolen car. By the end of her account, tears streamed down her face. Mark sat silently, guilt gnawing at him. He remembered the night he and Ryan had stopped Dr. Carter, how casually they'd approached her car without considering what it might feel like, from her perspective. Was this what she had meant when she talked about assumptions and accountability? When the floor opened for questions, Mark surprised everyone, including himself, by raising his hand. "Ma'am," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I can't speak for what happened to you, but I want you to know that we hear you. And I promise, we're working to do better." The room fell silent. The young woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his admission. After a moment, she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." It was a small moment, but it marked the beginning of a shift within the department. Officers started showing up to town halls not just as representatives of the law, but as human beings willing to listen and learn. Slowly, the walls of mistrust began to crumble. Ryan, too, found his footing in unexpected ways. Inspired by Dr. Carter's emphasis on transparency, he volunteered to help revamp the department's use of force policies. Working alongside members of the advisory board, he helped draft guidelines that prioritized de-escalation and communication over physical intervention. It wasn't glamorous work, long hours spent poring over legal jargon and debating semantics, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As weeks turned into months, the changes began to take root. The precinct saw a noticeable decrease in complaints against officers, and surveys showed a slight uptick in public trust. Of course, there were still challenges. Not every officer embraced the reforms with open arms, and not every resident forgave past wrongs overnight. But progress, however slow, was undeniable. For Mark and Ryan, the journey was deeply personal. They had entered the department believing their job was black and white: enforce the law, keep the peace. Now they understood that policing was far more nuanced than that. It required empathy, humility, and a willingness to grow. And though neither man would ever forget the night they pulled over their future boss, they came to view it not as a mistake to regret, but as a lesson that changed their lives forever. Dr. Carter, for her part, watched it all unfold with quiet pride. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but seeing her officers rise to the occasion filled her with hope. True leadership, she believed, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about inspiring others to find those answers together. And if the transformation she witnessed in Mark, Ryan, and so many others was any indication, the future looked brighter than ever. Months had passed since Dr. Elena Carter took the helm as police chief, and the department was beginning to feel like a different place altogether. The changes she implemented weren't just policies written on paper. They were living, breathing shifts in how officers interacted with each other in the community. For Mark Johnson and Ryan Davis, this transformation wasn't something they observed from afar. It became part of their daily lives, shaping not only their work, but also their perspectives. One crisp autumn morning, the precinct buzzed with energy. Officers gathered around the bulletin board, where a new initiative had been posted: community walks. Every officer was required to spend at least 2 hours per week walking through neighborhoods without their patrol cars, engaging directly with residents. It sounded simple enough, but for many, including Mark and Ryan, it felt daunting. How would people react? Would they be met with hostility or indifference? Mark decided to tackle his first walk in a neighborhood he rarely patrolled, the East Side District, known for its vibrant culture but also its strained relationship with law enforcement. As he stepped out of his cruiser and adjusted his hat, he couldn't help but feel self-conscious. His usual confidence wavered as he walked down the sidewalk, unsure whether anyone would even acknowledge him. To his surprise, a young boy playing basketball in a driveway waved enthusiastically. "Hey, officer," the kid called out, dribbling the ball toward him. Mark hesitated, then smiled. "Hey there," he replied. "What's your name?" "Jamal," the boy said proudly, tossing the ball into the hoop. "You want to play?" "Farah." The next 20 minutes, Mark found himself laughing and shooting hoops with Jamal and his friends. They talked about school, sports, and what it was like growing up in the neighborhood. At one point, Jamal's mother came outside, eyeing Mark cautiously. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone guarded, but not unfriendly. "Yes, ma'am," Mark assured her, "just getting to know the neighborhood better." She nodded slowly, then surprised him by inviting him inside for a cup of coffee. Over steaming mugs, they discussed everything from local concerns about speeding drivers to broader issues like employment opportunities for young people. By the time Mark left, he realized he'd gained more insight in an hour than he had in months of routine patrols. Meanwhile, Ryan chose a quieter approach for his community walk. He headed to the West End, a predominantly elderly area where residents often complained about feeling overlooked by the department. Armed with a clipboard and a genuine desire to connect, Ryan knocked on doors, introducing himself and asking if anyone needed assistance. At first, many were hesitant. Some peered through curtains before opening their doors, while others greeted him with polite suspicion. But Ryan persisted, listening patiently to stories about stray dogs, broken streetlights, and occasional vandalism. One elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson invited him to sit on her porch, where she shared memories of her late husband, a former firefighter who had worked closely with the police. "You remind me of him," she said warmly. He always believed in doing right by people no matter what. Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. For so long he'd thought being a good officer meant following rules and keeping order. Now he understood that true service went deeper. It meant showing up even when it wasn't convenient and proving that you cared. As weeks turned into months, these walks became a cornerstone of the department's efforts to rebuild trust. Officers reported feeling more connected to the communities they served, and residents began seeing familiar faces instead of anonymous uniforms. Even longtime skeptics admitted that the presence of officers on foot made them feel safer and more valued, but Dr. Carter didn't stop there. Recognizing that systemic change required tackling root causes, she launched several programs aimed at addressing underlying issues like poverty, education, and mental health. One initiative, called Pathways to Progress, partnered with local schools to provide mentorship and career guidance for at-risk youth. Another program offered free counseling services to both officers and civilians, emphasizing the importance of mental wellness in fostering healthy relationships. These efforts didn't go unnoticed. News outlets began covering the department's innovative approaches, highlighting stories of reconciliation and collaboration. A local newspaper ran a feature on Officer Lisa Chen, who helped organize a youth basketball tournament that brought together kids from rival neighborhoods. Another article spotlighted Detective Marcus Reed, whose work with the advisory board led to the creation of a safe space for teens to discuss their experiences with law enforcement. Even within the department, morale improved significantly. Officers, who once dreaded coming to work, now looked forward to collaborating with colleagues and engaging with the public. Weekly debriefings became opportunities to share successes rather than dwell on failures. And though challenges remained, Budget constraints, resistance from a few holdouts, and occasional setbacks, the overall atmosphere was one of optimism and determination. For Mark and Ryan, the changes sparked a renewed sense of purpose. They no longer saw themselves merely as enforcers of the law. They viewed their roles as bridges between the department and the community. Their interactions with residents grew more meaningful, and their ability to de-escalate tense situations improved dramatically. In fact, during a particularly heated protest over housing inequality, Ryan used techniques he'd learned in training to calm an angry crowd, earning praise from both protesters and fellow officers. Dr. Carter watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. She knew the journey was far from over. There would always be room for improvement, but she couldn't deny the progress they'd made. What started as a single traffic stop had evolved into a movement, one that challenged everyone involved to grow and adapt. On a chilly December evening, the department hosted its annual holiday gathering, a tradition that had previously been little more than a formal dinner. This year, however, things were different. Families from across the city joined officers for food, music, and laughter. Kids decorated cookies with bad-shaped sprinkles, while parents chatted with officers about everything from school safety to summer job opportunities. As Dr. Carter stood at the podium to deliver closing remarks, she scanned the room with pride. Gone were the days when officers and civilians sat on opposite sides of the divide. Here, in this moment, they were united, not by obligation, but by choice. When I first arrived, she began, her voice warm and steady, I asked you all to embrace accountability and transparency. I asked you to challenge assumptions and build trust. Tonight I see those requests reflected back at me, not just in words, but in actions. She paused, letting her gaze linger on Mark and Ryan, who stood near the back of the room. Both men straightened slightly, meeting her eyes with newfound confidence. What we've accomplished together is remarkable, she continued. But let's not forget, real change isn't about reaching a destination. It's about committing to the journey day after day, step by step. So tonight, let's celebrate, not because we've arrived, but because we're moving forward, together. The applause that followed was thunderous, filled with cheers, whistles, and standing ovations. For Mark and Ryan, the moment was bittersweet. They remembered the embarrassment of that fateful traffic stop, but they also recognized how far they'd come since then. That night, surrounded by colleagues and community members alike, they realized something profound. Leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about growth. And under Dr. Carter's guidance, they'd grown in ways they never thought possible. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Mark approached Ryan with a grin. You know, he said, clapping his friend on the shoulder, if someone told me 6 months ago that I'd be playing basketball with kids and drinking coffee with grandmas, I'd have laughed in their face. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Same here. But honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Together they stepped outside into the cool night air, looking up at the stars. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its twists and turns, but for the first time in a long time, they felt ready to face whatever came next. After all, they weren't just officers anymore. They were agents of change, inspired by a leader who showed them that even the smallest steps could lead to monumental transformations. Years had passed since Dr. Elena Carter first stepped into her role as police chief, and the department she once inherited, a fractured institution burdened by mistrust and outdated practices, had transformed into a model of modern policing. The changes weren't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but the culture shift was undeniable. Officers no longer saw themselves as enforcers alone. They viewed their roles as protectors, mediators, and partners in building a safer, more equitable community. For Mark Johnson and Ryan Davis, the journey had been nothing short of life-changing. What began as an awkward traffic stop evolved into a profound lesson about accountability, empathy, and growth. They often joked that being pulled over by their future boss was the best thing that ever happened to them, not because it was fun, but because it forced them to confront their own biases and rethink what it meant to serve. By now, both men had risen through the ranks. Mark became a sergeant, leading a team of officers dedicated to community outreach programs. His knack for connecting with people made him a natural fit for the role, and he took immense pride in mentoring younger officers. Remember, he'd tell them during training sessions, "You're not just wearing a badge, you're carrying trust, don't take that lightly." Ryan, on the other hand, found his calling in policy reform. He worked closely with Dr. Carter to revamp use of force protocols and develop new strategies for handling mental health crises. His efforts earned him recognition not only within the department, but also from advocacy groups who praised his commitment to reducing harm. Though he never imagined himself working behind a desk, Ryan discovered joy in crafting solutions that protected both civilians and officers alike. Dr. Carter's leadership style remained consistent throughout her tenure, firm yet compassionate, visionary yet grounded. She didn't shy away from tough decisions, whether it was holding officers accountable for misconduct or reallocating resources to underserved areas. But she also celebrated victories, big and small, knowing that progress thrived on encouragement as much as discipline. One spring afternoon, the department gathered for its annual awards ceremony, a tradition that had grown significantly under Dr. Carter's leadership. In years past, these events focused primarily on valor and heroism. Now they highlighted collaboration, innovation, and community impact. As officers filed into the auditorium, the air buzzed with excitement. Friends, families, and residents filled the seats, eager to celebrate achievements that extended beyond arrests and citations. When Dr. Carter took the stage, the room erupted in applause. Over the years, she had become more than a leader. She was a symbol of hope, resilience, and possibility. Dressed in her full uniform, adorned with medals earned through decades of service, she exuded grace and authority. But tonight her smile carried something extra: nostalgia. "Tonight," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "we honor not just individuals, but a collective effort. Each of you has played a part in shaping this department into what it is today, a beacon of progress and partnership." She went on to recognize several officers for their contributions, including Mark and Ryan. Mark received an award for excellence in community engagement, while Ryan was honored for innovation and policy development. Both men walked to the stage with wide grins, shaking hands with Dr. Carter before posing for photos. But the highlight of the evening came when Dr. Carter announced her retirement. The news sent ripples through the crowd, though it wasn't entirely unexpected. After nearly a decade at the helm, she had accomplished more than anyone thought possible. Still, the announcement brought tears to many eyes, including those of Mark and Ryan. "I've spent my career striving to leave this world better than I found it," she said, pausing to let her words sink in. "And thanks to all of you, I can say with confidence that we've done exactly that. This department is stronger, fairer, and more united than ever before. But remember, true leadership doesn't end with one person. It continues through everyone willing to step up and carry the torch." Her final message struck a chord with everyone present. For Mark and Ryan, it reinforced the lessons they'd learned years ago during that fateful traffic stop. Leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about inspiring others to grow, adapt, and contribute to something greater than themselves. After the ceremony, the celebration spilled outside, where food trucks and live music created a festive atmosphere. Officers mingled with residents, laughing and sharing stories under strings of twinkling lights. It was a fitting tribute to everything Dr. Carter had worked toward: unity, understanding, and joy. As the night wore on, Mark and Ryan found themselves sitting together on a bench, watching the festivities unfold. Neither man spoke for a while, content to soak in the moment. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "You think she'll miss this?" he asked, nodding toward the crowd. Mark chuckled. "Probably, but I think she'll be okay. People like her don't stop leading, they just find new ways to make a difference." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I used to think this job was all about catching bad guys and keeping the peace. Now, I see it differently. It's about connection, about making sure everyone feels seen and heard." "Yeah," Mark agreed. And honestly, I wouldn't have gotten here without her, or without that crazy night we pulled her over. They both laughed, the memory bringing back a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. That single encounter had set them on paths they could never have predicted, teaching them that even the most uncomfortable moments could lead to growth, if you were willing to learn. As fireworks lit up the sky to mark the end of the celebration, Mark and Ryan stood together, gazing upward. The colors reflected in their badges, symbols of the responsibility they carried and the legacy they were determined to uphold. They knew challenges lay ahead. The work of reforming systems and rebuilding trust was never truly finished. But they faced the future with optimism. Dr. Elena Carter may have been stepping down, but her influence would endure. Through the officers she inspired, the policies she shaped, and the lives she touched, her vision for a better world would continue to ripple outward. And for Mark and Ryan, the journey was far from over. They were ready to carry the torch, guided by the lessons of a leader who taught them that real change starts with honesty, humility, and heart. The night ended with a sense of closure and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to make a difference. But for now, under the glow of fireworks and surrounded by the community they served, Mark and Ryan allowed themselves to feel proud of how far they'd come. Together, they whispered a quiet promise to keep moving forward step by step, just as Dr. Carter had always encouraged them to do.